All right, so there's actually 3 ways we now have to calculate heats of the change in enthalpy of an overall reaction. So we have these in our notes from last time and from finishing the end of this unit right now, but I'm just going to summarize them for you on the board because there are a couple things that can get confusing that I want to make sure no one is confusing, particularly in the upcoming exam. So what was the first way that we learned to think about calculating enthalpies of reaction? So it's talking about bond enthalpies. And when we talk about bond enthalpy, the symbol that we see for a bond enthalpy is usually delta H. And this is where all the confusion starts because everything's delta H. It just depends on the subscript here, right, what kind of delta H we're talking about. In the case of bond enthalpy, often you see no subscript at all. But sometimes you do see a subscript, which would then just be delta H sub B here. So if we're trying to do this calculation based on bond enthalpies, for the delta H for an overall reaction, what we want to do is take the sum of all of those bond enthalpies of our bonds that are broken. And what we want to do is subtract from that the sum of all our bond enthalpies of our bonds that are formed. All right, so let's think a little bit more about what this means. So if we're talking about bonds broken, are we talking about reactants or products? Reactants. So essentially, we're summing up the bond enthalpy of reactants and subtracting it from the products. All right, great. So that's our first strategy there. The second strategy that we learned is thinking about bond enthalpies of reaction by using the enthalpy change in terms of the enthalpy of formation. So this one is sometimes a little bit more intuitive because we're talking about the enthalpy change it takes in order to form a given molecule. So if we're trying to do a calculation using enthalpies of formation, what we find is that delta H of the reaction is equal to the sum of the delta H of formation of products or reactants? Products, good. Of products minus the delta H of formation, and this is the sum again, of reactants. All right, and our third strategy is what we just talked about, which is Hess's law. And in fact, both 1 and 2 are applications of Hess's law, specific applications, but any application of Hess's law, you can use any way of adding up different equations to get the final enthalpy of the reaction.